Um, so do you agree with the idea that grammar, like broken into units, like the traditional way, doesn't need to be taught in school, and then why?
Right. Well, yeah, I do agree with that. And as I can show you on the board here, is basically they've done like all sorts of studies. I've been, composition is my professional um, focus, and so I've been involved with the National Writing Project and the Gateway Writing Project, and I've been on the NCTE national boards and the National Writing Project boards, and it basically is shown that teaching grammar in isolation, like the way I was taught, and the way my aunt used to teach as a teacher, just is not effective. There have never really been uh, any studies in the last 100 years that have proved that teaching that way helps writing, and that's my big focus: writing and reading closely. And I just much rather see teachers focus on revision than to spend 6 weeks, as some of my colleagues did when I started here 33 years ago, on gerunds and diagramming sentences. It just kills writing, basically. And so I don't think we can really find justification in doing it.
Okay. Like when you were in grade school or high school, were you taught grammar? And if so, do you think it was helpful or not helpful?
No, I think that I was taught. Yeah, that's the way I was taught all through grade school. And like I said, I had an aunt that was an English teacher, and she was a strict grammarian. She was an English teacher, and so I mean, and I grew up in a household of. I remember one of my earliest thoughts in grade school was diagramming sentences and all that kind of stuff. And when I started reading and writing, because I write every day. I never sit there when I'm trying to write anything. I don't start off by saying like, well, okay, how can I start off with a compound sentence?
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Throughout your years of teaching English, have you noticed like a decline in the I guess like the maximum level of grammar?
The thing, it's not so much a decline. It's just that language changes. So you and I were talking the other day. We were kind of kidding around about the semicolon.
Right.
Kurt Vonnegut, the great writer, said that you can never be a good writer if you ever use a semicolon. And it sounds kind of dramatic, because semicolon is really good in a lot of different things. I love using a semicolon when you put an idea together, especially when you use the word however, when you qualify the idea. But the language has gone from, if you look at like something from like the 1800s, just the way they constructed sentences, like some of the best writers and stuff like that, they really had a lot of different kinds of structured sentences. Now we're doing things a lot differently. We're trying to modern writers are kind of reducing the sentence structure. You put the subject first, and you have a short kind of first clause, and then you can extend the sentence as long as you want to. But you don't find those kind of structures where you need like the semicolon and stuff like that. So like there's certain things that just the language is becoming more, in some simpler, but more beautiful in a way. It's the syntax of the sentence is actually changing. So it's hard for us to grow up in those kinds of periods. We're used to language of like 30 years ago to kind of give credit to kids and stuff like that. But when I think about it, today, some of the papers I've read from my students have been some of the best papers I've ever read ever. So I'm concerned that writing is always declining, and you hear people talk about that all the time. But that's because it's changing. I mean, things like Twitter and email and stuff actually have an effect on the language. I mean, people just don't write like Shakespeare did anymore. But he was writing completely different than the people that were 40 years before him too. So I think we kind of recognize the beauty in the language that we see, instead of trying to look for this perfect language that doesn't really exist. And that's kind of what the rules of grammar are. They described the way they thought language worked, and we've done a lot more research into what language is about and how it's formed and how we create it. And so some of those rules don't really apply anymore, because they just didn't really, they were descriptive, but they weren't really prescription for how to write language. And language is always going to keep changing.
Right. And do you think, like you said, it, like the language is getting a little simpler? I
Yeah.
remember we were talking about how that's something to do with like people not reading anymore. You know, because when you
Yeah.
read a certain level of book, then you
Right.
pick that stuff up. But if you don't read after like grade school, then you're probably not getting that. You know, like the introduction into that high level of writing with grammar. You know.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about that. I think when you're talking about, if you're talking just about isolated grammar exercises, they just don't work. But when you're talking about the whole sense of literacy and people not reading, that really bothers me. Because I think that there is something you get out of, reading some of the great classics that you don't get out of, like, say, Game of Thrones or something like that. I mean, there's a whole bunch of studies where people, for a long time, a lot of kids are reading all the Harry Potter books. But those books weren't making them go to more difficult books and more intense books. So I'm really concerned about necessarily the diminishing appetite for more difficult literature. I think that's really important. At the same time, like I say, I don't know if we're reading less. You probably have like 5,000 texts on your phone from this week, that kind of thing. So, I mean, in a sense, our whole culture is about reading and writing. It's just a different kind of thing, approach to it. And I think that with technology is going to be really frightening, because instead of writing a letter, we used to write letters. But these people like were moving across the country and had to write just to keep in contact with family and stuff. Now you can just talk into your phone, and the letter will be written for you by some program. So I'm really worried that people don't have that contact with words on the page. I really do. Having to put together, having to difficult, express your ideas, because no matter what you do in life, you're going to want to have your ideas expressed in your work, and that's going to take critical thinking. So yeah, I am kind of concerned about that.
Okay.
But that's not grammar.
Yeah, I know,
That's
but
all right.
I'm just
Yeah.
saying. Okay, so I feel like that like creates a cap. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I feel like you can't not as many people who aren't reading like every day, reading like great books, like you said,
Right.
like the classics. I feel like they're like kind of limited, because without being like you said, grammar doesn't need to be taught. Well, if the
Well,
grammar isn't,
that way.
well, yeah, in the
Yeah.
traditional sense
Right,
of
yeah, yeah,
just
yeah,
sit down
yeah,
and
yeah.
study.
You should work it into. You need a grammar. You need to be concerned about writing and the way
Right, and I think-
authors focus. But
Yeah.
the traditional way of grammar we're talking about is not really.
Yeah,
yeah.
and I was saying, like, if that's not in it, which is fine if we're not taught the traditional way.
Right.
Usually the supplement of that is you read, like I was saying, like you read
Yeah.
it and you see, okay, well, wow, that sentence was really long, like the sentence you had, but they could make it that long with punctuation, or they
Right.
could, they could do stuff with, like, the sentence is just so like eloquent, just great, and you're just like, wow, well, how can I make mine like that, And
Yeah.
then I feel like that kind of like broadens the reader's horizons. And with people not reading, it's like, well, they don't see any good sentence besides the sentences you hear. You know what I
Right.
mean? And that
Right.
they're not visually seeing that, so I don't know if that helps the same.
Well, one of the things that really does work is like modeling with sentences. And like, so you give a kid a sentence. Like, one of the things I like to do is I didn't do it so much with your class because you had history and English, and so our focus was a little different on the writing. But a lot of times, what I'll do is like I'll give a classic sentence, like a real long sentence, and have the class just change the subject, and then figure out, okay, if you change the subject, keep the syntax of the sentence alive, and so you keep all the adverbs and all the adjectives and the clauses and stuff the same. But because you change the subject, what do you have to change in the sentence to get it to make sense?
Right.
So that's a kind of fun thing. That's modeling. That's a really neat way of doing it. Sentence combining is really great. I think sometimes you can take a paragraph. I think the big problems with student writing is not the sentence itself, but the connectedness between sentences and paragraphs and thoughts that have a longer thing. So I like the idea sometimes of just taking a paragraph and asking them, what sentence would you take out? You know, in a
Right.
paragraph, taking like a classic.
To like
adverb or
make it
something.
like better or make the most sense.
Well, I think sometimes it also, a lot of times they find that there's nothing they can take out. Because a lot of these sentences, these paragraphs are so well constructed that when you take out this, you lose an idea. I think that's really important. So I think playing around with language is really important. To be every day, to be something playing around with language. In your class, like we did a lot of close reading, you know, that kind of stuff like that. And, you know, I'd tell you like, take a passage or take an idea out of like, say, the natural. And then, you know, when you quote it, then go back and think about, well, why was this word important? What is this? What, you know? I'd always say like,
Yeah.
you
What
know,
is
what
the
this
meaning
thing?
of this? Blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like
What
that.
they're trying to get there. How they crafting the text with the language they have. That's what I think is really kind of important. And
Okay.
that's missed. I think that deep level reading is really what education is all about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was kind of talking about, cause the lack of reading. Cause
Yeah,
you know, I don't really read any books anymore. I used to when
Right.
I was in grade school, but you know, just for fun, cause you know, there's books and. But now it's just like I feel like I don't know. There could be something that changes with the books because like all the fantasy and stuff
Yeah.
like that. That's interesting when you're young, but then when you're older, those books are seen as like for kids, and you know what I mean. So
Right.
I guess that kind of is another deterrent from like reading because the books aren't really fun anymore.
right. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of kids in your class, you know, that would probably read the last book they ever will read. I mean, the kids you graduate with, and that's bizarre. I think though that, like with technology particularly, here, let me close the door.
All right.
Um, the problem I think too with, and I love technology, but I think, and we're, you know, it's really a great thing to have, but things follow you around. Like you don't have to look up anything because it just follows you. All the information comes at you, and I think that there's a kind of a sense that you know, instead of when you read a book, you have to like imagine the scene. You have to think about you have to picture yourself. And with all the kind of stuff you have now with you know, movies and stuff, it's easier to watch the movie than it is to read the book. It's easier to watch you know, a lot of kids go through graduate school even not reading at all. They just skim through their books and then they watch like a program. They think that like, you know, watching the History Channel is just as good as reading a book, you know, watching a documentary on that. And I think that you have to really make yourself available to that kind of stuff where you try to create and imagine for yourself instead of, you know, you have to turn everything off just to kind of engage with that kind of material. Because if you don't really have it in yourself, if you don't create it yourself, if you don't think about yourself, I think you're losing something drastic, you know, in a really important way. So, yeah, I'm worried about that. I think the falter, well, where's literacy going to go? You know, we don't really, you know, it just changes the way people are. I mean, sometimes we're just in, you know, the technology and the environment create who you are. We can't hold on to things that don't exist anymore. I mean, we have to follow literacy where it's going. And so it's definitely going into, you know, computer games and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes kids learn more in computer games than they do at school. They're spending 50 hours a week, generally, teenagers on social media and other things outside of school. That's a whole work week, you know. Are they doing that much in school? You know, I mean, how much do you play any games?
Yeah, I usually play on the weekends though. I don't play during the week because I have a lot of homework and stuff like that.
But isn't it crazy that a kid will spend like, you know, all these hours on Fortnite and learn this complicated, you know, kind of rules of a game and stuff like that, but they won't spend much time on mathematics or, you know. What is it that's so compelling about those things? I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think basically we're going to have to adapt some of that stuff to education. That's how it's going to have to change. You're going to have to make education, you know, compete with those like, you know, Warcraft. Or I don't know what you guys play, but there's a lot of research about that too. I mean, one of the things that they talk about with especially these online shooter games and stuff like that. A lot of them are kind of military focused games. And when you get into those games, you're all of a sudden like in a persona. You're like a warrior. You got a group of people. You got a lead. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on in those games that's really compelling. Somehow we got to like make school compelling again. I mean, we got to give kids a feeling, like a sense of destiny, like they've got to do something because they're part of a system. That's probably the worst thing about school and reading and stuff like that. You just don't feel like you're going anywhere. Everybody's got somebody that reads in their family. If you think about it, there's all these people that have their whole lives have been changed because they start reading books. You know, is there somebody in your family that reads a lot?
My mom's a lawyer. She reads all the time.
So, you know, it's just something like that. I remember, like, when I was a kid in college, I started reading 100 pages a day. But I read a lot when I was a kid anyway. I read comic books. I read everything like that. I really enjoyed reading anyway. I think I just loved doing it. I remember when I was in college one time, I bought a book, and I was walking home, and I was reading it. And then I saw some girl that I really liked going by in a car. She started waving me, and I thought, oh, this is not a good idea, you know, to be reading a book, walking down the street. You look like a weirdo, you know. But I think that kind of thing, just being immersed in something like that, you see people, really smart people, that's their life link to everything, history, you know. You get to know people in books better than you knew your own family. You know, sometimes you get to read about all these people's most important moments in their life. Your grandfather's not going to tell you about the failures all the time. They're not going to go that deep as you get somebody like in King Lear or something. That's a pretty amazing immersion. And I think that's really important. I mean, people don't read that way anymore. So, not many. But the people that do, they're going to be different too. I mean, if you really want to be somebody in the world, you're going to have that kind of passion. I can gauge people, I can grade people almost on their inquisitiveness. I mean, you can tell anybody that gives a project, like how are they inquisitive? Do they really care about it? You can almost grade on that. You can see the work that somebody does. Can't you? See how much people are involved in it? That's something else, and you can't give that to people. They got to have that themselves too. So, you know, those are the people that are going to be important in the future. There's going to be a lot of people that they're just going along, but those other people that want to create and solve problems and work together and collaborate and give people a sense of destiny, yeah, that's really important. I don't know. Do you think those grammar exercises, do they do it for you?
Not really. Okay, but that's different. Like,
what did you like about it? What was your favorite reading?
I feel like the grammar exercises that are necessary are the ones that like society calls for. Like the lack in, you know,
right.
Like if you because you know what's like lacking in
the grammar
society.
that opens doors.
Right. Okay.
If you want to be a doctor,
yes.
You got to be able to have. You know, you just can't make. Those are mechanical mistakes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I feel like some of those, like, because if you can tell, like maybe you take like a practice test just to see what students are lacking, then you might be able to touch up on that stuff. But like you said, the formal, like, traditional way isn't really helpful anymore. But I feel like grammar still needs to be taught in some type of way, you know, because you can tell there's been research about how like students like taking like the ACT or stuff, well, their English or their writing will be so bad, and like the English scores are going down, you know, stuff like that.
Right.
So I feel like if you just like find like common mistakes that everybody makes in like common like everyday conversations, and you like teach why that's wrong, or you know, teach why like change it, then that'll help instead of just going just what a gerund is, like you said. It took a long time on that.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, last year, and I taught them the same way I taught you, but the AP class had the highest scores ever in history of school in English. So, you know, I'm really happy about that, you know. But I think that, like, you know, it's not, I think it's not, I think the stuff that when I first started teaching, my colleagues were teaching all this, like, you know, separated grammar skills, and they weren't teaching revision. They weren't teaching longer essays and stuff like that. And the success we've had with just focusing on the things that actually work as opposed to things that don't work. Is really important. What you're talking about is basically that you don't want to be caught not being able to go to that next step in life, whether it's graduate school or medical school or something like that, because you're having grammar problems. But that's usually not the case. By the time you get to that point, you've read so much, you have a natural affinity for the language. It's just really the best thing for you to do is keep writing and reading. That's where your grammar skills will come in. It won't be from diagramming. You'll never get.
Yeah, not diagramming, but I feel like, I guess maybe some instruction on like what the ACT English section covers, or
Right.
just like teaching people that when somebody says "How are you," you don't say "good." You know what I mean? Stuff
Well,
like that.
that's kind of mechanics.
Yeah.
And stuff. Yeah. And I think I think that's something that it should be taught in school, but also taught at home. But I think that when you look at things in a broader sense, even the ACT and SAT and even AP, a lot of those tests are not always the most accurate description of how you're going to do well in school. Some of the schools are actually, we're going towards a whole thing of trying to go to mastery level kind of things. Transcripts where you basically kind of create your own portfolio. The best schools in the country are moving away from some of those standardized tests too. The standardized tests are only a snapshot of where you are at a moment. Your most important presentation of yourself is going to be in the writings you do in school over time, that kind of stuff like that. So whether you miss like 10 questions on a standardized test, that's not going to be the important thing. It's like what you've produced in class and what you've produced over time and how you're going to approach your work when you go into college. That's what's really going to be important. Because if you're in a situation where you have to go through remedial work in college, you're not prepared for that level of inquiry, So, I mean, I think that the best thing for you to do is write a lot, get feedback, talk to people, go to the writing center when you go to the first thing you do to go to college. But definitely, I mean, how does your mom go about it? She's got to write stuff all the time.
Well, she read a lot, so.
Well, that's it.
As a kid, like, she read a lot, and then in her job, she reads a lot of contracts, because she works at Equifax, and she just like, I don't know what her actual title is, but she works at Equifax and just handles contracts and stuff like that.
Well, that's how I learned how to write too. I just read every day and wrote every day. I mean, that's the thing, and you write for different groups. Like if you want to be into a different group, you got to write your way in there, and you learn how to write by writing.
Yeah,
that sounds kind
and
of
that
crazy,
that's what we were talking about. How there's a problem though, because people don't read like they used to.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, they're just not going to be involved in it. Here, can you come back?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to get involved in any, I mean, we talked last time about literacy is kind of like you throw a pebble in a pond, and there's these ripples. There's all different types of literacy. There's literacy that you talk to your friends, that language you talk to your friends, that grammar you talk with your friends. There's the formal education, grade school, high school, college grammar, and language literacy that you talk there. And then when you get in a job, you get a different kind of jargon, you get a different kind of way of talking about it. And the only way you can do it is to read in that way. Like last year when we got you to do those JSTOR articles, reading JSTOR articles are so much different than just normal text. And we just try to get you guys to get involved with that kind of literacy. But I mean, I think we asked you to do a lot with what you had to write and what you had to read. So that's what you do. You look at your mom, see what she does. She just writes it. She passes it to friends and say, "What do you think of this?" Right? And then she goes up in front of a judge, right? So I mean, if you're a lawyer, you got to actually present your work to somebody, and they critique. There's nothing more. I can't imagine much more intense writing than having to pass your word as law.